Constitution, and then they installed a debt-based money system right after that, and then they finalized it through the Federal Reserve Act. So it was a series of steps. And then with FDR, what happened was he, whether he knew what he was doing or not, he created, through the Emergency Banking Act, first he made the American people an enemy of the state, in that because they did some phrase changing phrases in the Trading with the Enemies Act and initiated the Emergency Banking Act. And there was good reason for a holiday on banks because of the situation in the economy, which was orchestrated again by the Federal Reserve. Milton Friedman said so, then present day, revisiting the New Deal and the fact that these alphabet soup agencies that were created were public projects, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Those were all struck down by the first Supreme Court, and then Roosevelt threatened to stack the courts, creating a 9-judge court system. And so he was in office long enough where they put in the judges that they wanted. They started out, then they started with this idea that the Constitution is an evolutionary document. My whole premise is, on an 1897 Supreme Court decision, the intent of the law is in the language the lawmakers use. So that's a sub-theme of that portion. And I take it up to the Federal Register, for one thing, was created under Roosevelt, but then with Truman, it was given, the agencies themselves were given the power to create legislation like we were talking about. Okay, so so you have federal agencies creating legislation. You have the president creating legislation through executive orders. I go through some of them. They have the right through these executive orders to take away everything that we have. Our food, our water, everything. And some, I go through some of the political history up to the present day, and then what we can do about it in that first, as Americans, in the first part. The second part has to do with money creation. I go through William Jennings Bryan, the creation of money in the United States, and how gold was always a false, something that money powers put out in order to control the population. And so I go through that story ending with William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech, where he says he stands with Jefferson about paper money. And then I tell how money is created, and that's what this is going to be. It's a condensation, it's an attempt to condense, and so I'm hoping you'll kind of get what I'm talking about. The third part is a brief history of money from the beginning of agriculture, because that was the first system of money creation was in Mesopotamia, where the river deltas would create the silt and stuff periodically, and they introduced what I call mass production grain-based agriculture. And that created the stimulus for war. You needed slaves to do that kind of work, and the city-states arose. Anyway, I go through that and the history of money up to the present day, and how we were led as misled as progressives by all of these legislation stuff. So the theme of that one is there is no new thing under the sun. And in the fourth part, we have an epilogue. My cousin wrote that about the Constitution. It tells a story about how the Founding Fathers were. I helped him write the stuff about the history of the Founding Fathers, how they bickered amongst each other. They didn't always have our best interests at heart. It didn't matter, because what they fought with their honor and their blood. They lost their lives, they lost their sons, they lost their families in the war. So they sacrificed a lot, and what they gave us is something that is beyond, we have failed to live up to its promise, basically. And I'm talking about the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence, not the amendments that come after, because in the first part, I try to lead you into understanding that after the Bill of Rights, there's reason to suspect all of those amendments that come afterwards. So that's it. Oh, in the last section, and I have a website for this too. The last section, really, I didn't put that the underlying theme, but it's in at the end of the epilogue. And this is from the Supreme Court of 1803. All laws which are repugnant to the Constitution are null and void. So that's the theme of the fourth part. Anyway, I've got themes for each part because they're different, but they come together so we understand that not only do we need a new system of money creation, a constitutional system, I might say, but we also have to start dissolving the power structure that surrounds the Federal Reserve. It's not just enough to create money if we're really going to make any difference. So we're going to start out. What I've found with some of my presentations is sometimes people really still don't get it. So you might have to go back and reread. There's other methods of money creation than what I'm talking about. Richard Cook, I linked to on my website. He's got an article he does on the social credit money system. So I talk a little bit about those two. And apparently there's another one I learned at this conference, but I don't really know that much about it. So, and I'm getting the impression that what I'm talking about is in the middle of those two, because the social credit money system has an annual dividend built into it. But in my opinion, that's not good for our system of government, and I hope I'll show you why. But to start out, please keep in mind John Kennedy, what he said about what we're talking about the way money is made. And basically he says, the study of money above all other fields is one in which complexity is used to disguise the truth or evade it. And this is how economists are taught in the school system. They're not to reveal the process. The process by which banks create money is so simple, the mind is repelled. So try to get that.
Did you say that people that they're taught not to reveal that?
In the economic school, when you study in some of this, you realize, you read Anthony Sutton and some of these other sources, almost every field of education has been altered and watered down, or certain facts selected out. You know that with the textbooks. You look at the elementary schools now, and they have to be politically correct. I was a librarian many years ago in another life, and I used to think that I used to hold out hope that the libraries were the best chance for kids to learn how to think, and teachers to get themselves weaned off the textbook, because a lot of teachers I knew didn't like the textbooks, teaching only to the textbook. Until this thing with teach to the text, the textbooks came in, all these mandatory tests, which part of their purpose is to dumb us down. But you have to study that in depth. There's all sorts of, it might take you a couple of years to do. I've got lots of links if you want, books. But that's another issue altogether. So yes, the economic schools were taken over, and there's bankers that talk about it, and economists themselves, but they're usually suppressed. You're not going to hear about the mainstream media. So that's why I say, as a librarian, forget the mainstream media. They're just not going to tell you the truth. They didn't tell us about the 2000 selection. They're not going to tell, or the 2004 vote rigging. They didn't tell us about 9/11. They didn't tell us a whole lot of other stuff that is maybe even worse than that. So they're not going to tell us the truth. So anyway, we better keep going. This is long. Title of this is Money Owed and Owed, and that's the title of the second. And that's true. That's why I call the book The Two Faces of Money. Okay, so here's Hemphill, credit manager of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank, and he wrote in a foreword to a book that was published in 1936. Money is the most important issue. This was, and we have not got a permanent money system, he said. This was after the Federal Reserve Act, and after FDR declared people enemies of the state, and with the emergency banking law, and then what he did is confiscate the people's gold. Because the people, the original Federal Reserve notes, if you take out your Federal Reserve note, so verbiage changes on it. Right now it says, good for legal tender for payment of debts, all debts, public and private. That's what it says. But it used to say, at one point in time, redeemable for gold. So people would store their gold in bank. This is a technique old as, from ancient Babylonia. The people would put their gold, because it's too hard to carry around, they put it in their banks and assume that it would be out. They could take it out when they needed it. So during the Depression, when things began to slide, that's why the banks didn't have enough money, because people were starting to take the gold out, And the banks were actually investing in Germany, overseas. So I've got a lot of speeches of McFadden in there too.
Oh, yeah.
Anyhow, so we got to take a look real quick at what money is. Money is an agreed upon medium of exchange. Just keep that in mind. It's a medium of exchange. It's a method of facilitating the barter system. Okay? It's also a measure of value, a means of payment, or wealth reckoned in terms of money. So those are all definitions. The most important one is, for us, medium of exchange. So we've had a lot of things used throughout history as money. Sheep, cattle, wheat, tobacco, hemp, beans, shells, gold, and all these other, bronze, iron coins. Yak dung was once used as money. So there's lots of different things that can be used as a medium of exchange. The problem is they're kind of cumbersome to trade, value. It takes a bit of doing. Green stamps. I know you remember, I do, when green stamps were accepted as money. You saved up your green stamp and you could trade it in for something. Hemp was once used to pay taxes. It was considered an asset in the colonies to make rope and sails, and the farmers grew it right up into the war. World War II, in fact, there was a program for hemp for victory, campaign program for World War II. Farmers were supposed to do their part by raising hemp. So all of the above that I talked about are money, it can be looked at as money of exchange. With the exception of green stamps, all of them are also commodities. And so the problem with commodities, like gold or anything else, is that the individual value fluctuates according to market demand and all this stuff, and also according to monopoly supply. And gold is controlled, it's one of many things. Oil is another. The prices are deliberately manipulated by a select few. So, what are the functions of money? Well, the first two are met. The functions are met with our current money system, because you use money to activate and encourage production of goods and services, and also simplify the exchange of goods and services. So it's easier if you've got a set piece of paper that tells you approximately the basket of goods, the value of the basket of goods. And instead of exchanging hemp for tobacco or whatever it is, in a co-op, for instance, a farmer with his ancillary artisans might say, "I'll get the eggs, you make it into cheese for me, and we'll trade." Make the milk into cheese, something like that. The third one is the most important one, and the one that usually is the most messed up in economic schools and everything. The third function is to provide a standard unit of measure for measuring the value of goods and services and for storing savings. The problem with this idea is the key things. In order for money to serve as a stable means of measuring a stable value, you have to stop inflation, deflation, and economic depressions permanently. What a concept. Richard Cook yesterday was telling us, he was showing the difference between the actual production in the economy and the GDP. And there's a gap there, and that's what economists are always trying to manage, is that gap, so that it doesn't get too big and it doesn't shut down the economy. It's a mathematical system, and parts of the economy have to be shaken out every once in a while because you've got the mathematics of it, it's impossible. Okay, so because the value of individual commodities fluctuate, they can't serve, obviously, as a stable medium of exchange. Gold, silver, all that stuff. There's two main methods of money creation. One is debt-based, and the other is debt-free. And in what I'm talking about, the process of extinguishment is important for both money systems because it ensures that inflation won't happen, or if inflation in the first system at least can be managed. In debt-based money systems, what we have is credit serving as money. The banks create our money and then charge us interest for the use of that so-called money. That's how it's done. And despite constitutional provisions to the contrary, that's the money system we've been laboring under in whole or in part since the founding of the country, with the exception of a couple brief periods, including Lincoln, when he began issuing the greenbacks. There was two segments of greenbacks. The first one is really not talked about that much, but it occurred with right before the the legal tenders of 1862 were authorized by Congress, and the first one was actually truly debt-free, but the second one got an exception clause where the bankers started fiddling around again and said, well, you know, it's good, except you've got to pay, you can only exchange it, the tariffs and other things had to be paid in gold. So that was just another method of profiting even off the greenbacks, but still the greenbacks served their purpose, and I've got a whole lot of stuff on a chapter on Lincoln on that. But right now, we have bank fiat money. Rather, we don't have government money, it's bank fiat. And because of that, the banks create our money, and because of that, the government is probably guilty not so much of overspending as it is guilty of over-borrowing. And what it's doing when it does that is using the labor and assets of we the people. So every time you see them raising the debt ceiling, they're actually pledging your labor. In fact, there was under Clinton there was some sort of provision, and I forget under which department, but they are valuing each of us. You know, this is how much each of us can earn in a lifetime. So they know how much how much they can get out of us. Of course, they phrase it in better terms than what I am, but you know, more politically correct terms. But that's what's happening, and it's getting even worse. I'm doing a series of derivatives, and it's a lot worse where it's orchestrated now on a global level. It always has been on a global level, but it's really bad because you've got the IMF who made policy statements of sorts, and on my paper I show you the links, but the IMF is saying, well, the central banks we know that we've got a problem with these individual banks experiencing credit problems. With the derivatives, what they're doing is manufacturing money outside the normal banking system laws, and so we're getting credit problems, with liquidity problems within the individual banks, and so we have to rescue them. So this recent fiasco with J.P. Morgan taking over Bear Stearns, they did it with taxpayer money in addition to what the Fed pumped in. So we paid for the takeover of a company that survived the Great Depression and a whole lot of other things, but I'm not going to get into that. So here's a cartoon. Hopefully that'll help you understand a little bit what's going on. You've got the people who are giving over their labor, their services, and all of that stuff so that the banking system can earn its interest on the credit that they're issuing and we're using as money. And the governments are feeding that. Feeding the banking interest, because the banking interests really have managed to gain a stranglehold over government officials in a lot of different ways, and I go through that in the book. Okay, now the second neglected method of money creation, this is what I call the debt-free democratic money system. Our own, if we did this, it would be owned money. And so it provides for money to be spent into circulation by the government, the way the Constitution says, or by the monetary authority, whatever is designated as such, interest-free. So that is a money of exchange, and the other type is really a money of accounts, because you need to calculate how much interest is due on each loan or bond that you issue and all of that, and keep track of it and how it expands, and we're going to go through that in a minute. In the early days, gold and silver actually owned money because a regular miner, just a regular person, could go out and mine gold or silver, and then he'd go to the U.S. Mint and have it turned into gold or silver, and they could spend those coins into circulation debt-free. So that was, at that time, owned money. Just like a farmer, for example, could go and raise a field of hemp and pay taxes with it. So that was debt-free money. So you can look at your $5 bill and ask, what does that really represent? Is it, money that represents our wealth and owned by us truly, or is it owed to someone else? And here's a lot of people that said it's owed to somebody else. Robert Hemphill, I'm not going to read that, but Here's one from the Committee on Banking and Currency, 1964, in a pamphlet called A Primer on Money. And they said a dollar is based on credit, and every dollar in existence represents a dollar of debt owed by an individual, a business firm, or government unit. Another one, you can read some of this later, from Money and Economy, a pamphlet issued by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, 1981. Our supply of money is the result of creating money as loans based on the total reserves in the banking system. So hopefully you're beginning to see what Gail Brooke was talking about. The way money is created, the way banks create money is so simple, the mind is repelled. Okay, in our current system, money is created of loans, therefore it represents debt. And I don't know if I'll go through the tiered system or not, we'll see. The interest associated with this debt money is not created as money, okay? So if, just as an example, say you go and take out a loan for $1,000. So you spend that money into circulation. That money gets out there and other people can use it, and you get to buy what you wanted, whatever you took the loan out for. And at the end of the year, let's just say you're the only one that took out a loan. At the end of the year, you're going to owe that $1,000 plus the interest. So there's only two ways that you can pay that money back, even assuming that you were able to earn all that $1,000 back, because you still owe the interest. So you can either take out another loan, or you can see if you can renegotiate and defer the debt, at which point it's going to grow exponentially. So we'll go through that with some charts in a second.
I had that happen to me a couple of years ago. I thought it was my bank calling up and telling me that they were making loans at a very low interest rate. And when I get one, and I had some debts to pay at the time, so I took it out. And it turned out to have a low interest rate just for a certain period of time, and then it vastly escalated, and it took a long time to pay it off, and it was just awful.
It is, but see, the system is, it's as if somebody doesn't take out debt, that's what they're trying to do, is get you to take out more debt, because right now they've got to have enough money in the system so that they get paid their interest. So the more debt, the better. If we don't have debt, we don't have money, basically. And
that's the way the banks feel.
Right. Not the feel, that's the way the system is set up.
It is.
Right, and a lot of people in the government have known it before, and they should know it now, especially in the banking committees. McFadden was one of the most articulate on that. Lindbergh was another one. There's a lot of officials that have talked about this. Okay, so in this type of money system, total debt grows exponentially, and it eventually becomes unpayable once the new debt money creation can no longer be supported. Okay, with some kind of asset, and somebody somewhere willing to work hard enough to repay it. So you have to work harder and harder to repay that. Now, because the money is extinguished, the loan principal gets paid off, and so your attempts to pay off the debt sets up a money shortage, and that triggers demand for more borrowing, and that's in order just to preserve the money supply. So we have former central banker Bernard Lettier talking about creating money shortages. He says, while economic textbooks claim that people and corporations are competing for markets and resources, I claim that in reality they are competing for money using markets and resources to do so. So it's just the other way around. Greed and fear of scarcity are being continuously created and amplified as a direct result of the kind of money we're using. For example, we can produce more than enough food to feed everybody, and there's definitely enough work for everybody in the world, but there is clearly not enough money to pay for it all. The job of central banks is to create and maintain currency scarcity. I don't know if that's exactly accurate, because the banks, that's what they do, and they do it deliberately. It's a bookkeeping method, but they want to make sure that they get their interest. Here's a cartoon that shows what's happened, especially like during the Depression or what's going on now. You've got people going hungry and an oversupply of goods locked up behind the banker stores, because those people can't get the money to pay for the goods and services that a lot of times they've produced. Okay, unpayable interest. A key feature of debt-based money is that it has unpayable interest attached. This unpayable interest is what makes debt-based money and money of accounts, and accumulating unpayable interest causes debt to expand exponentially. Here's a cartoon that, you know, the little boy, the teacher is saying, well, 93% of the debt is compound interest, and so that means that 2 plus 2 equals 4 today, but tomorrow or in 5 years, 2 plus 2 is going to equal 5. And the little boy is saying, well, sir, where's the $5th going to come from? Good question. So we've got some flaws. They're in the current system. They are inherently unstable because of the need to increase the money supply at ever faster rates. As more and more money is going to pay exponentially increasing, accumulating interest rather than for actual goods and services. You've got that interest embedded right into the cost of goods, wages, and everything. Debt growth is governed by the formula for calculating compound interest. This formula is based on the exponential function, which is one of the most important functions in mathematics, and it's also commonly used in finance. Variations on that formula depending on what needs to be determined. Debt-based systems essentially attempt to define mathematical law. More details are in the Two Faces of Money. The inherent stability is a global phenomenon since some 170 countries manage their economies through a central bank. And these are supposedly coordinated, if you will, through the Bank of International Settlements. You can read more of that in my, it raises questions for national sovereignty and a whole lot of other issues, so you read more of that in my book. Here's Bernard Lettier again. Monetary instability is actually a global phenomenon, which is getting worse as we speak. But he says your money's value is determined by a global casino of unprecedented proportions. $2 trillion are traded per day in foreign exchange markets, 100 times more than the trading volume of all stock markets in the world combined. Only 2% of these foreign exchange transactions relates to the real economy, the flow of goods and services. Instead, it's all going to speculation. And 98% are pure speculation. The global casino is triggering the foreign exchange crisis, and then he goes on to all of these different things and is triggering another crisis right now. So now I've got a chart to show you visually what's happening, because in the beginning years, it's not that noticeable. You know, people don't really understand it's insidious until it just gets out of control. So this is it's showing the law for the exponential formula for calculating compound interest. D equals P times 1 plus R, which is the interest rate. So debt equals the principal times 1 plus the interest rate to the number of years. And you can see the darker gray portion at the top is what the unpayable interest is. So it explodes in the outer years following this exponential law formula for calculating compound interest. And there's the money supply down at the bottom. It's being far outstripped by this compound interest. And some of this actually becomes ingrained in the economy because you know, parts of it are actually goods and represent real goods and services. Okay, so again,
go back to that last slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, sure. And it's on my website, so you know, you can also go back to my website and look at this.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so this is about the Federal Reserve System. You know, I just talked about that. They are coordinated or managed by the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. The Fed is a de facto leader because it's been set up as the world's reserve currency, and that gives it a lot of economic advantages and power advantages too. They were put on the board of the BIS, I think in 1994, the Fed. But it's all the same people. But what I want to emphasize is that it's the system which is at issue, not the employees or the individual banks within the system. In fact, the small local banks have probably absolutely no idea what's happening to them. They're suffering as much as the rest of us are. Okay, 3 key points. What we use for money is not nearly as important as how that money is brought into circulation. Again, we basically have bank fiat, not government fiat money, because the banking system creates our money, and we have to pay interest for the use of that money. If the government did create our money, we would have no public debt, but we might have lots of inflation if no attention were paid to the rules and principles of monetary science in the process of extinguishment. Hopefully I'm going to make that clear in a few minutes. But if it were done, then we would have a true and inherently stable money of exchange. And here's the Federal Reserve. I'm not going to go through all of this. You can go through it. They don't. The coins are basically the only money that the government is creating for us. And what the Fed does is, it's a privately owned cartel, by the way. Go on to the Federal Reserve website yourself, and they'll tell you they are a private corporation operating for the public benefit. If you believe that, I got a bridge I can sell you. But anyhow,
I didn't know that. Gee,
so what they do is they create money, U.S. legal tender, by buying government or other types of securities through open market operations with money it doesn't really have. It's created out of nothing through bookkeeping entries, which allows then the government to write checks and get them spent into circulation. It's really bizarre. A lot of people do. This is the part that I think a lot of people get hung up on. So it issues money at face value. It can print the money at a cost of production. It has the, it pays to have the currency printed, but it's less than 4 cents a bill to have that money, and then it gets use of that full amount of the money. It helps the commercial banks, the big banks, create 10 times or more money, more debt money through what's known as the fractional reserve deposit expansion system. I should have deposit in there. It's not, the Federal Reserve itself has never, this is a big complaint for a lot of people. It's never been fully audited, and it makes policy decisions in private with only partial minutes of the meetings issued 3 weeks later, and verbatim minutes are never released, nor are they kept. There's many design flaws in our current system. Unpayable accumulating interest, I hope you got that. Exponentially increasing debt, you saw that on the dumb equation. The growing shortage of money relative to the debt, the inherent instability caused by the attempt to defy mathematical law, and the fact that the Fed can increase or decrease the money supplies through policy decisions made in secret. This is an awesome power. Okay. How the Fed controls our money supply? Well, it does it in a number of methods. Buying the securities from the government helps it. The securities can be bought by individuals, but when the Fed does it, the money supply can be increased. It can also increase the money supply by raising or lowering the reserve requirements, and that affects all banks and all districts. It also can set the Fed funds rate, which is the rate the banks pay each other for loans to each other. And raising the Fed funds rates tends to lower the loan demand, and lowering it tends to increase the loan demand. It will decrease the money supply by selling off government securities, which decreases the reserves to the system. So the Depression, you can see there's the graphic there. What happened in the Depression was there was a contraction in the money supply and an oversupply in goods and services. But the people, because of the contraction, and this has happened several times, many times in our history alone. So this wasn't the first. There was an 1893 panic that led to Coxey's Army. Go look it up. It's really an interesting and horrifying story. That was a global meltdown like the one we're going through now. But in the Depression, there was, again, an oversupply of goods and services because we are a productive people. And there wasn't enough currency, so we were going hungry. While Roosevelt confiscated the People's Gold on pain of $10,000 fine or 10 years in jail or something like that. I got it in my book.
Is this Franklin D?
FDR, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And then he turned around 10 months later and sold it at a profit. He didn't sell it. What he did was revise the gold dollar. So I explained that in my book. And the government achieved a profit on that. And this was done so as to pay the bankers' debts that they had gotten themselves into. So you can read the details. But basically, during the Depression, Milton Friedman, everybody knows Milton Friedman, he said, well, the money supply was deliberately contracted during the Great Depression. That wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last, unless we get out from under this. And so, you know, the people went hungry basically while the cartels cleaned up, cartel bankers. So what are the principles? We can look at some of, you know, how they're profiting from some of this, and here's just a graph, you know, that tells you in the various forms that the assets that the commercial banks have been able to amass from 1950 to 1980. And I use this because it's very convenient, it's already done for me. But in 1950, the bankers' assets in all these different areas was $160 billion, and then it rose in 30 years, just in 30 years, to 2,000 billion, 2 trillion. Okay? What happens about the 12 reserve banks, the Federal Reserve banks, the regional banks around the country? Well, monetary analyst S.W. Adams says this: the assets of the 12 reserve banks jumped from 15.5 that's billion in 1938 to 52, almost 53 billion in 1953, which was, you know, 20-some years later. As of November 14, 2007, according to the Federal Reserve's own report, the assets of the 12 regional banks total now almost $1 trillion. That's how much they're growing. And other ways that they amass money. There are some constitutional questions on this. First of all, the Fed effectively controls the nation's money supply, and therefore, and the interest rates, and so it manipulates the entire economy. And a lot of people argue, correctly.
The Fed, you mean the Federal?
The Federal Reserve.
The Federal Reserve.
Right. And many people argue that this is in direct violation of Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution that expressly charges Congress with the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Now, the thing of it is that if you look up the definition of coin, that means to make or create. So I'm going to go through some other articles a bit later about where people get mixed up with the idea of gold. Anyway, so we have the fractional reserve money creation system. It's a two-tier system, basically. The chain starts with when the Federal Reserve purchases securities from the government, and the second tier occurs with the commercial banks. And essentially, in both cases, new debt has to be incurred before money can be created. Although they're doing it now off the banks, off the balance sheet of the banks through derivatives. But that's another story. So this is a formula. I'm not going to go through it. You can check it out yourself. But what it says is when given, say, a 15% reserve requirement that the Federal Reserve Board will set, if the Fed creates checks totaling $1 billion, you're purchasing the securities that the government put up, using us as collateral, and then they deposit those checks, or credits actually, in the commercial banks, with the 15% reserve requirement, that means that the banks, the commercial banks, and maybe some of the banks lower than that, could create $5.667 billion in new debt money, and then you'd have a total, when you add in the Fed's billion, of $6.667 billion. So it's a matter of math. Again, a lot of this is basically 5th grade math if you wanted to spend the time and figure it out. Okay, so with the commercial banks, then what happens is most money is created by commercial banks, actually, that we see in the form of checkbook money. They call it checkbook money. The banks get the reserves that they need from the Federal Reserve, and the money created through the reserve system is usually called high-powered money because it can be used to expand the money supply. The Federal Reserve Board alone determines reserve requirements. The lower the requirements, the greater the amount of money that can be made by the commercial banks. Higher requirements contract the money supply. So another example, a 10% reserve requirement then allows a system of commercial banks, given an original $1 billion deposit from the Fed, to create a maximum of $10 billion in new debt money or loans. Now, looking at it, in more personal or down to our level terms, there's a really good book I would recommend reading. It's got an incredible story in there by a farmer, South Dakota farmer, called "Bashed by the Bankers." And he gives this illustration. Think about that as a rancher. I put it in ranching terms, using a 10% reserve requirement. For instance, if I had a cow and she had a calf, I could sell that calf 9 times over and still have the calf to butcher and eat. I could have a full stomach all winter and have all my bills paid and a good profit too. That's what's happening. Okay, so there's 3 steps here, to create the debt. Congress, first of all, has to raise the debt limit, and that's what they're doing now, I think, just about every year. One of the points here to look at, some of the new reserves trickle down from the big banks, where the debt money creation always begins, first with the big banks. And so there's designated bond dealers that can deal with the bonds, and then the big banks get to create the money first, and some of it will trickle down to the small and medium-sized local banks, and they become part of this debt creation chain, a lot of times unwittingly. Okay, those are steps for, some more steps. Let me see. With the exception of coins, all of our money is really created, really debt acting as a substitute for real constitutional money. Real money would be created and spent into circulation by the government, tax-free and interest-free. What a concept. Instead, we continue to let private corporations use the government's own power to create money and loan that money to us, charge us interest on the use of that money. Okay, let's look at the national debt now. Let's see what we can compare it to what happened in the early years before the Federal Reserve was passed. It's over $9 trillion now in debt. It depends on what the interest rates is and all, and who's counting all of that. But it's around $9 trillion, give or take a couple billion, a few hundred billion. And by comparison, in 1910, the federal debt was $1 billion, and state and local debt was virtually non-existent, which is totally not the situation today. Just go look at your state and local governments and your schools and whatever. Until we get into another accounting method, and that may change the picture, but I talk about it in my book, and you can research that yourself. Today's debt then averages out the total debt to $28,000 plus for every U.S. citizen, man, woman, and child. Now, given the fact that I think the government estimates that 69 million people aren't paying their taxes, I mean the tax-paying age people aren't paying their taxes, and neither are children, that amount is going to go up higher, so you'll see different estimates. The interest on the national debt for fiscal year 2003 was over 318 trillion. This billion. This averages out to $157.26 in taxes per citizen for fiscal year 2003, and that has gone up, of course. In fiscal year 2003, private debt also totaled over 40 trillion. So a lot of us always hear about the deficit spending, and we think that during the Clinton years, everything got better. Well, the deficit decreased a little bit, but here's a chart that shows our national debt and how it grew from 1993 to 2005. So in 1993, the federal debt was just over 4 trillion, and at the end of 2005, it was over 8 trillion. So that gives you a graphic representation of what's been happening to the national debt. Now let's look at it again in more personal terms. Let's say that the yearly interest on the national debt is about $400 billion. We're just for the sake of argument, because that will change, from year to year. So even without an increase in the total debt in 10 years at the same interest rate, you have $4 trillion worth of interest that's going to be added to the debt, just interest in 10 years. This illustrates basically a hope how the essentially unpayable and exponentially accumulating interest eventually will create unpayable debt. All of this, of course, again, is governed by mathematical law. So you can look at it also in terms of your mortgage. A 30-year mortgage for $100,000 you create, say, at an interest rate of 8.5%. You've got a monthly payment of $721 plus. You made payments over 30 years, totaling $270,000 plus. But again, only $100,000 of that was actually created with money. So you have to pay the principal plus the interest of $171,000. Plus, as the principal is paid off, the debt and the debt money associated with it goes away. So no debt, no money. Unless enough new money then is created as debt, there's not enough money in the system to pay the interest and the principal. Again, right now they're creating money off the balance sheets with derivatives, but by the time that money gets down to us, it's diluted by fees and interest rates and all of that stuff. So it's the inflation on it is just ballooning. But anyway, over time, more and more money, again, has to be created as debt. And in order to pay the increasing debt caused by you have to get more and more money so that you can pay this increasing debt, and that's just plain dumb. If you refer to get that dumb equation back in your mind.
Oh.
Now here again,
You mean dumb, not just, that's not a synonym for something else, is it?
well, it's a synonym for that dumb chart, the dumb equation, debt plus unpayable interest, and debt equals unpayable interest and the money supply. So the debt is always greater, and that's the chasing game. You have to figure out a way to pay that debt. So here's Lettier.
So essentially, DUM is DUMB.
Yeah. Right. Bernard Lettier again on the effects of unpayable interest in your mortgage. Now in your mortgage, of course, you pay the interest in the beginning years rather than the outlying years, which is convenient for the bankers because guess what? When you sell your house after year 7, 10, or maybe year 15, they've got their interest, right? They've collected their interest, and you have to start all over again. Anyway, Lettier, money is created when banks lend it into the existence. When a bank provides you with $100,000 in the mortgage, it creates only the principal, which you spend and then circulate in the economy. The bank expects you to pay $200,000. Now he's using over 20 years, so he's using a different formula, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't create the second $100,000, which is the interest. Instead, what you have to do, or the bank, he says, sends you out into the tough world to battle against everybody else to bring back the second $100,000. Lettier is actually talking more about community currency, which I'm saying maybe if the economy collapses, that's what we're going to have to go to. But really, this money system is going to, if we could do that in the right way soon and take the money away from them entirely, it might be to our benefit. Okay, the law of universal debt growth. This is important to remember again. Creation of money as interest-bearing loans serves to exponentially expand the debt. You saw that in the debt chart, how that in the outer years, just balloons. This is obviously governed by mathematical law, using the exponential function commonly used in finance. You can call this phenomenon expressed by formulas using the exponential function, the universal law of exponential debt. The law shows that overall debt, including interest and principal, grows slow at first, and then it expands. And it's due to the effects of unpayable interest, what I call the tyranny of unpayable interest. And I said this because a lot of people, including Ron Paul, will say it's the tyranny of paper money, but it's not. It's the tyranny of unpayable interest. And you see there what's happening in terms of debt. On the bottom portion, the lighter color, you've got federal debt, and that's what we all hear of, right? But look at what's happening since 1980 in particular to private debt. I mean, that is really the biggest problem. That's what's squeezing you and me. And will be, it's really getting awful right now. So total debt, new numeric form. In 81, so it's like 24-year times difference. In 81, the federal debt was just over $1 trillion. In 2005, it was over $8 trillion. In 81, the private debt was over just over $4 trillion. By 2005, it was somewhere around $40 trillion. That gives you a total debt in 1981 of $5.2 trillion, and in 2005, you've got a total debt of about $48 trillion, maybe $50 trillion now. And I use some examples for even calculating or comparing it using the value of the dollar in 81 in 1936 compared to, so you're comparing more apples with apples, because a lot of people want to say, oh, well, we can explain it away. Okay, inflation is another big thing, cause for confusion, especially among economists. And so here's what they say. They all argue over the cause of inflation, back and forth, back and forth. Their definitions will vary from time period to time period and between who the economists are talking to, but they agree on these three basic points. Sustained long-term increases in the price of goods and services is inflationary. An increase in the amount of money in circulation is related to inflation, and the dollar is devalued by inflation. So we've got inflation correctly defined. And you have to remember that the debt is growing exponentially because of accumulating interest. So more and more money has to be created. So you're seeing the three causes here. More and more money has to be created to pay the interest on the debt, which is again expanding exponentially. The process sets up a chronic and ever-worsening shortage of money relative to debt. Remember the dumb equation again. And over time, wages and prices have to rise just to pay the interest costs, never mind the actual cost of goods and services. Therefore, inflation in a debt-dominant system like the Fed is correctly defined as debt-induced currency devaluation. And here's a chart of showing kind of what's happening. There's a vicious cycle that's set up that gets worse as time goes by. So debt forces consumers to shop for bargains, and it forces businesses to seek out those areas of the globe with the lower costs of production, labor and otherwise. In fact, I just heard a guy on one of those money shows saying, well, there's no shortage of cheap labor out there. You know, we can find slaves, and why not? Both have to do this, or they face bankruptcy. Both groups have to do this. The overall effect of globalization, then, is forcing both prices and wages downward as more of the wealth gets shifted up to the top. So it's not really workers or businesses, with the exclusion maybe of a few corporations, but it's not really workers or businesses, nor even the banks individually that are the root cause. It's the money creation system we're operating under. So you've got here another illustration of what's really going on, because the name of the game is always create distractions. And you've got the banksters, if you want to call them that. He's saying, he's got his little hounds and his rifle, and his hounds are the economists, the bankers' agents, TV and the press. And he's saying, hey guys, look over there, it's them apartments that's causing that darn inflation. Keep at them, you know, go get them, boys. And who are these people? Paper money, farmers, welfare, labor, you name it. You know, it's everything else, but there's the key factor, which is, you know, what I showed you in the dumb equation. It's the accumulating unpayable interest. What we need is a system with monetary equilibrium, where you're creating money into the system in proper proportion to the goods and services that are produced. So it's not, you don't have to keep increasing the money supply if the goods, so you're not, in our current system, you've got waste and overconsumption built in. We have to have overconsumption. You know, that's part of the system to keep it going. But in this system, the money supply is dependent on what the people are able and willing to produce and consume at any given point in time. Monetary equilibrium is a mathematical impossibility in a debt-based system because of the effects of accumulating interest. This means that these kinds of systems are inherently unstable. Also, monopoly control and continuing fluctuations in the value of individual commodities like gold, wheat, or anything else have always provided oil. Profit opportunities for the few, but not a stable currency for the many, or an underlying value for the currency, anchor for the currency. Now, by contrast, a debt-free system can be mathematically regulated with fifth-grade formulas in a way that could achieve monetary equilibrium and maintain currency stability, which would eliminate recessions, depressions, and inflation, deflation, period, forever. So, what are we talking about in terms of a debt-free money system? Well, monetary equilibrium would be the condition that would exist when, two conditions, interest payments, fees, or special taxes that are being removed from circulation are in balance with the debt-free expenditures being spent into circulation by the money authority. And it's also where primary debt can never exceed the total circulating money supply. Remember the dumb equation. Debt equals unpayable interest plus the money supply. Debt always exceeds the money supply. In a public credit money system, which is the one I talk about, It varies slightly from some of the others. I talked about the social credit, and you can read the article from Richard Cook. He kind of explains it, and I've got some other links to other, what he's talking about is based on an engineer's work. I like this one because I think it gives the power back to people by the way it's set up. So let me go through this. It achieves monetary equilibrium through a set of principles and simple math formulas, fifth grade math, that will balance the money supply by balancing debt-free federal expenditures with interest payments plus federal taxes or other types of fees that might be needed. They're only when they're needed, and all of these are used to extinguish only the debt-free federal level expenditures. Okay, it's completely transparent because it's got fifth grade math formulas. Anybody can and it has to be codified into law, so anybody can check on what's going on. It's not going to be some policy decision made in secret. It's not subject to policy decisions, again, made in private, because these things can be codified into law. Any move, moreover, that the Congress makes to increase the ceiling interest rate, which would be charged by the Treasury, maybe for loans to banks, just as an example, or any move to impose new federal taxes or other fees by the federal government would provide an automatic signal to you and me that the money supply is out of balance. They're creating too much money for whatever reason they have, and we, the people, would be notified automatically just because we know that this is going to be increased. The system itself can be balanced automatically and impartially with computers so that the proper balance is maintained at all times, and so it inherently stabilizes the purchasing power of money. Now, because of its design, it also, again, helps return the balance of power to state and local governments where it properly belongs. That's the way our government was designed to begin with the founding documents. Now, Benjamin Franklin talks about the principles of monetary science back in the colonies. I've got more examples in my book. There's a lot of talk about money creation, money in the colonies. Colonial script, they call it, causing inflation. Read the stuff I have in my book. But Franklin was actually cited by Adam Smith for the colonial script that they issued in his area. But he was called to England during the 1700s. The Bank of England was installed. That was the first bank that used this kind of system to loan money, partner up with the government, and use their taxpayers as assets, collateral. So England, right from the get-go, was in a lot of debt. They were borrowing money from the Bank of England, and they were going into all these wars. And this was despite the fact that they were collecting fees and taxes from all their colonies all over the place. So they were looking to the colonies for revenue during this time. And the colonies were themselves prospering nicely, despite the fact that England was draining the coffers of gold and silver, the colonies' coffers. And so Benjamin Franklin was called before the British Parliament during one of his visits and asked how he could account for the newfound prosperity in the colonies. And he replied, "That's simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It's called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers, in this manner creating for ourselves our own paper money. We control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay no one." There was a couple colonies that did run into problems because they weren't extinguishing their money, the way that Franklin and most of the other colonies did. Abraham Lincoln also had a lot to say on money, and I've got a couple of his quotes. This was entered into the 76th Congress somewhere around 1935, and certified as correct by the Library of Congress. But this is just a list of a couple of his principles. There's more I have in the book. But it's interesting because it tells you exactly what could happen constitutionally. And he says, "The government should create, issue, and circulate all currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity." He was right. Debt-based versus debt-free monetary systems. I've got on one side what the dumb equation is. Debt always exceeds the money supply because of unpayable interest, And in the other system, you've got the money supply equal to E plus D, where E equals the expenditures by the Treasury, the federal government expenditures, maybe to run the government, to create if you want a universal health care program. I'm not really in favor of that, and I talked about that a little bit in my talk this morning. I'm beginning to lean more and more to a health savings account so that we have control. We don't have this bureaucracy running around the middle telling us what to do. Anyway, so the money supply is equal to monetized debt-free Treasury expenditures at the federal level plus total debt to the Treasury. So let's look at what that, we're going to look at that in a minute, but here's what's going on. The governments are having the banks create the money, and they've got a leaky bucket. The interest is running out that leaky bucket and going back into the banks. And here's the little farmer, peasant, come along saying, hey, you're wasting your time. Throw your big old basin out and keep this one. I've got one, it doesn't have any holes, and guess what? It's smaller. So we've got, now I just want to go through, I've got some descriptions in my books of what I'm talking about. Here's a tale of two countries, Bankland and New Liberty. What's going on? Bankland has got the illusion of wealth, kind of like what's happening now. It operates under a debt-based money system. Its debt is growing exponentially because of the accumulating interest, and therefore it's subject to the dumb equation and the formula for calculating compound interest. So in the last 4 years, Bankland's Congress has voted every year to increase the national debt level so that it can borrow more money, even as it moves to spend, to cut social spending and searches for revenue-producing so-called investments as part of the public-private partnerships. Look it up. You'll be amazed. Anyway, Carlisle, and among others, are interested in buying up our ports and privatizing them. And Dennis Kucinich actually squared off against the bankers because they wanted to buy up, they wanted their corporation to buy up Muni Life. And Dennis said no. And so
buy up what? To buy up what?
Muni Life, the power company, the electric company. And Dennis said no because he was elected on that platform. And they pulled a bunch of scams, and Dennis, 31 years old, they're YouTube in, you'll see that segment, a local news story, and then another segment where there was an assassination attempt made on his life because of his actions. And I got into a lot of trouble because a lot of people said, I didn't like Dennis because he threw Cleveland into bankruptcy. But 10 years later, the city council had him back because he saved, I don't know how many billions of dollars by keeping Muni Life private. So I have some stuff on that in my book as well, on the way we are privatizing this stuff, and we've got all these levels and the costs of just shooting through the roof.